Caribbeans, Puerto Ricans, Jamaicans did not create hip hop, nor did they influence the culture and the music that became known as hip hop. Stay with me. I put out several short video clips talking about the influence of hip hop, as I'm someone who is from the hip hop generation. I basically grew up with the genre in the tri-state area. A lot of these artists would come to the radio stations and give their music. We would hear them live. There was no delay. Anyway, so when I started having these conversations about my experiences with hip hop in the earliest days, one of the things that I mentioned was, which I didn't think there was any controversy, was that the Black Americans whose family members migrated from the South to New York City, that these people, what I call in my thesis, the heirs of the Great Migration, the heirs, the inheritors of the Great Migration, these were the people who started hip hop music, hip hop culture. They drove the culture, they drove the music. And to my surprise, there were people who took issue with that. We just recently celebrated what everyone recognizes as the 50th anniversary of hip hop back in August of 2023. Will mark the 50-year anniversary of hip hop music. And it starts with a DJ throwing a party who was of Jamaican origin. And some people note that as evidence or as the beginning of the birth of hip hop.
I'm that guy who started all this mess, okay? From b-board to dancing and making it to groove on. That's it.
And even if you take that one narrative, even if you just say, okay, Kool Herc, the DJ from the Bronx of Jamaican descent, was the first person to, create hip hop, which is ludicrous. And shout out to my Jamaican family, you know what I mean? And my Puerto Ricans and folks from the Caribbean, I got mad love for y'all. This is not, any slight to anybody. This is just setting the record straight. This is just, straight up and down, just like, calling people to the table and setting up guardrails for our culture, because people's been stealing from Black American culture and taking from Black American culture without recompense and without gratitude. We have to really be careful about who we invite to our cookouts and whatnot, because some folks come because it's the place to be, it's live, it's gonna be popping and all of that stuff. But then when they leave and then they start having their own cookouts and they start mimicking the things that they learn and the things that they saw us do in our cookouts, and then we don't get invitations, and then at some point down the line, it's the birth of this particular cookout style is created by this group without any acknowledgement of the fact that you didn't know anything about this cookout until we invited you in, and then you learned what you know about it and took it over there, and now you're making these claims, right? That's a metaphor, but it's applicable. And this has people up in arms because they'll say, well, there was Puerto Ricans and Jamaicans and all these Caribbean people living in New York City at the time. Of course there were. There were about 900,000 in the 1970s. There were about 900,000 Puerto Ricans in New York City. And about, say, 50,000 Jamaicans living in New York City in the 1970s. So people are suggesting that people, Jamaicans, Puerto Ricans, folk from the Caribbean who came to the United States, right, with a completely different culture, found themselves in an established culture in New York City amongst Black people who had already been there, who had already been in the United States for at that point, 400 or so or 400 plus years. So now they're arguing with us that the people who just migrated from the Caribbean, this is 1970, let's say 20 years. The families just came to New York City 20 years ago in the 1950s, but that's probably not the case. It probably is more like in the 1960s, 1970s, right? But let's just say they came back as far as 1940, right? Black Americans started to migrate to New York City in the late 1800s. And by 1910, you have the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance is a period of cultural explosion like we've never seen before anywhere in the United States.
Amidst the fervor of the Great Migration, bold, exciting forms of black music evolved, along with venues to listen and dance to this music. Blues and jazz clubs became a central part of life in Harlem, where artists such as Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington, Bessie and Mamie Smith. The era also saw the burgeoning of literary work by and about African Americans, which the writer Alain Locke compiled into an anthology. He called it The New Negro, and its name came to define a movement.
One of the main arguments that people who support the myth that the Caribbeans, Jamaicans, and Puerto Ricans were the founders of hip hop. They say, well, because there were, a significant amount of graffiti artists and dancers who were Puerto Rican, and of course, Kool Herc, and there were some rappers and DJs who were Caribbean or Jamaican and Puerto Rican, and they can name a few of them. But you got to remember, we're talking about the dominant. See, what needs to be said is this: when people from the Caribbean, when they came into the United States, their culture was not dominant. They were folded into the dominant culture, the Black American culture. By the time hip hop comes along, we have already almost 100 years worth of creating music, dance styles with no blueprint, not mimicking anybody. People say, oh, well, that music style, it came from the continent. If it did, it came genetically. It came through DNA. It didn't come from turning on the TV and watching folks get busy in Africa or listening to, folks' African music on the internet. It didn't come from that, right? It came from a new identity that became Black American people, right? The creation and the carving out of a new identity, right? From nothing. We can't allow people to muddy the water. Because what these folks are saying is they're saying that, the Caribbean folks, I'm going to just say the Caribbean, which will include the Jamaicans, the Puerto Ricans, those two groups alone were a little over 130,000 people compared to 3 million Black Americans. Let's peel apart their argument. This is what they say. They say that hip hop was was Jamaican and or Caribbean or Puerto Rican culture. All right. Where's the music? Where's the sounds? Where are the sounds? Where are the common sounds in hip hop that Puerto Ricans were listening to in the 1970s? Where does it show up? What samples? What parties were the hip hop parties that were playing this music in the 1970s? What parties were playing the Jamaican music? Bob Marley was big. Where is he sampled? Where is he sampled in hip hop? Where is Bob Marley sampled in the early foundations of hip hop? Where? Where are the biggest Puerto Rican, Caribbean musicians? Where is their sound in hip hop? You don't find it. But what you do find, you find Louis Armstrong, you find dances that resemble the Lindy Hop, you find Duke Ellington and those kinds of, you find James Brown, you find the Commodores, you find LTD, you find Earth, Wind and Fire, you find the jazz musicians, the blues musicians, the funk musicians from the South, Black Americans. You find all of that in the early constructs of hip hop. That's all you find. That's all you find. Even the DJs who were from the Caribbean and had the opportunity to take Caribbean music, sample it, play it in the parties as a DJ, never did. A step further back. The first public broadcast of music on the radio stations in Jamaica came from where? It came from Black American artists. This is the Great Depression era, 1920s, 1930s, 40s, or whatever, right? Like the first radio stations in Jamaica and the music that they were playing was all Black American music. Before there were any recordings in Jamaica, This is what they were listening to. This is what they were influenced by. And then when they started recording themselves, they would remake Black American music. I think they call it rockers, right? Right? Black Americans have never taken claim for reggae. We've never said rockers is Black American music because they sang old soul and old R&B songs. No one says that. No one would ever say that. We don't want it. Like, that's dope. Y'all did it. Y'all did the thing. Reggae belongs to y'all. We're not trying to house that from y'all. A small group of people is not coming into the United States, the mainland, impoverished, right? Coming from the Caribbean, trying to find a better life. They're not coming in driving culture. The United States, Black Americans are oozing culture and music, oozing it. So much of it we forgot about. So Black Americans did not need for Caribbeans to contribute. The contribution was due to close proximity. Close proximity, meaning living within the communities of Black Americans in New York City and acquiescing and understanding the music that they were listening to that was popular, the popular songs that was happening all around them. And using those songs, these Black American artists, most of them from the South, using those sounds to throw parties, to create break beats, to sample and to produce records and sample from. And so that's the reason why 50 years later, hip hop is still dominant despite all of the debauchery and everything else that come with it, the music, and that's another conversation for another day. But the essence of it is still alive. It's just become corporatized, and the vultures have swooped in and have misdirected it. But that's not the point. The point is the culture and the essence of it is still in the hands of the people who invented it. These are the same people who invented jazz music, R&B music, funk music, gospel music, rock and roll music, you name it. The same lineage. This is not Jamaican culture. This is not Caribbean culture. This is not Puerto Rican culture. Y'all need to stop it. Y'all need to stop. I love y'all, man. We brothers, man. I grew up with a bunch of Jamaicans and Puerto Ricans, and we family. And I know a lot of folks from the Caribbean don't ascribe to this, so this don't apply to you. But for the ones that's out here peddling this nonsense, y'all need to fall back with that, man. Y'all need to fall back with it.